टोटली डिफरंट दॅन द DNA फिंगरप्रिंटिंग आणि DNA करायचा, अनालाइज करायचा, हे करायचा, ते करायचा, सिनोम जोडत बसायचंय, हे मला फारसं उपयोगी वाटत नाही. हे जे काम आहे ते डायरेक्ट बरोबर सूर्य जयद्रथ. आणि अजित सर, मला तुमचं कौतुक करायचंय, अभिनंदन करायचंय की तुम्ही हा पुठ्याला वेचलात बरोबर आणि त्याला एवढ्या लोकांना त्याचं दर्शन घडवून आणलं, त्याचं ऐकायची संधी दिली.
नाही सर, ते रघुनंदनच्या मुळे बरं का, म्हणजे रघुनंदन ती लिंक लावून दिली सगळी.
तर त्याचं असं झालंय की तुमच्या संस्थेचं नाव आता सगळ्या ठिकाणी झालंय की नाही, ऑर्गनायझेशन विच इज इंटरेस्टेड अँड डेडिकेटेड टू दिस काइंड ऑफ. आणि बाबांचं तू काम इतकं छान पुढे नेलं आहेस, तर मग मी आता सरांबरोबर मराठी विज्ञान परिषदेपासून होतो.
हो, नाही खरंच, म्हणजे
एक वाक्य मला अजून आठवत आहे. तुम्ही 10 झाडं कवठाची लावा, तुमचं नाव आपण कवठेकर ठेवू. तुम्ही एवढी वडाची झाडं लावा रस्त्याच्या कडेला की लोक तुम्हाला वडगावकर म्हणले पाहिजे.
बरोबर.
अत्यंत बोला की.
नाही, तुम्ही सर पूर्वीचा जो तुमचा ग्रुप होता सगळा मराठी विज्ञान मध्ये सगळ्याच ठिकाणी, तुम्ही काय बरोबर माझं आपले घाणेकर सर म्हणा, सगळेच इतक्या तरुण वयापासून काम करताय सगळे डेडिकेटेड, प्रश्नच नाही. म्हणजे
तुमचा ग्रुप छान जमला ना की काम छान होतं.
खरंय, ग्रुप चांगला जमला पाहिजे.
ग्रुप एकत्र असतात, मजा असते. खरंय. एक गायला लागले, कॉलेजची जबाबदारी वाढल्या, कोणाची घरची जबाबदारी वाढली.
बरोबर.
इट इज बेटर टू फेड आउट ऑफ द पिक्चर.
करेक्ट.
सगळ्या संस्थांमध्ये असंच असतं.
खरंय.
त्यामुळे पुढची पिढी निर्माण करायला आपल्या हातात नसतं.
हो.
पण यू आर ऑलवेज स्टँडिंग ऑन द शोल्डर्स ऑफ द जायंट, याची पण जाणीव ठेवायला लागते. नाही,
कसं आहे सर, सगळे लोक मदत करतात, काय म्हणा, सगळ्या तुमच्यासारखे सगळेच हे असतात आपल्याला, त्यामुळे ते होतं. सानेबाई आहे, तुम्ही आहात, सगळेच म्हण, कुठलेच आपल्याला हे नाही. महाजन सर तुमचे एसपीचे विद्यार्थी आपले अध्यक्ष. त्यामुळे तसं आपल्याला सगळ्या लोकांचं हे आहे, संस्थेला असतं थोडक्यात, त्यामुळे तो खूप छान.
माझ्यातर्फे शोनीलचं स्वागत करतो. आणि आता तुमची वेळ लागली असेल तर आपण
येस, चालेल सर. बरं झालं, पण सर छान वाटलं आलात तुम्ही. ते
ठरवलंच होतं.
नाही आला तर छान बरं वाटलं.
5:55 वाट बघत होतो.
हो, नाही ठीक. येस सर. सुनील काय आता हे करतोयस?
हो, सुरू करतो.
एक दोन मिनिटं. आपला हा रघु आधी जो परिचय करून देईल.
बर.
आपण 6:05 ला करू सुरू. 6:05 लोक येतात. 1-2-3 मिनिटं आहेत अजून.
आपण साधारण 6:05 ला सुरुवात करतो. 6:05 पर्यंत वेटिंग रूम आहे आपल्याकडे. वेटिंग रूम येऊन सगळे जॉईन होऊन आपण बाकीच्या लोकांना म्यूट करतो. हॅलो.
हा, मी गोगटे बोलतोय. नमस्कार. मी आय एम ऑल्सो हिअर.
हो, तर आपण सगळ्यांना म्यूट करतोय आता.
नाही, ठीक आहे. म्हटलं मी जॉईन झालो एवढं सांगतोय.
नमस्कार गोगटे साहेब.
नमस्कार. तर म्हटलं सर सगळ्यांना हाय हॅलो म्हणावं अगोदर, वेळ आहे तोपर्यंत.
शोनील सर म्यूट झालाय तुम्ही.
हो, रघु सुरुवात करणार आहे ना?
हा,
रघु
मी
सर
व्हिडिओ ऑन करायला पाहिजे का?
काय?
व्हिडिओ ऑन करायला पाहिजे का?
हो, व्हिडिओ ऑन करायला पाहिजे तुम्हाला.
हा, नाही इथे पॉपअप आलाय. ओके ओके.
मी बाकी सगळ्यांचे व्हिडिओ बंद करतोय म्हणजे आपल्याला बँडविड्थ
नमस्कार.
होईल आणि फक्त तुमच्या दोघांचे व्हिडिओ चालू ठेवणार आहे.
बरं.
बर.
माझा सुद्धा व्हिडिओ मी बंद करून ठेवलाय. आणि मी आता रघु सरांचा व्हिडिओ पिन करतो आणि तुम्ही हे करू शकता. रघु सर, आता आपण इंट्रोडक्शन.
हो, इंग्रजीत मराठीत दोन्ही काय?
इंग्लिश मध्ये करू सगळं.
ओके. शोनीलचं काय? इंग्लिश मराठी मिक्स मध्ये, म्हणजे मिक्स
कसं आहे?
अधूनमधून मराठीतनं काही कल्पना करेन.
कम्फर्टेबल
पण
असाल त्या पद्धतीत करू.
हा,
ठीक आहे. मग इंग्लिश मध्ये
हो चालेल. इंग्लिश
करायचं का सुरुवात?
हो, सुरुवात.
सगळ्यांना नमस्कार. Shonil, as I know him over last 25 years, is an achiever, I would say, and another is thorough academician. These two words are more than enough to describe him. His recent achievement is professorship, but until I knew up to last 6-7 months, he was not professor. Just I noticed he has become professor, and to be a professor at Open University or Oxford University, it's really it's an achievement. Plus, he is now head of social science, School of Social Sciences. That's another achievement. So every year there is some other achievement. That's one thing. That's the show. That's the person Shonil I know. Anyways, now I'll just read out whatever script is just before me. He is with School of Social Sciences of Open University. He is an ecologist and environment geographer. His interests are cross-section or interface of natural and social sciences. In particular, environment, development, sustainability, these three. He is now with Open University, but before joining Open University, just before working as a head, he was a lecturer of geography starting from February 2003. And before that, he was with University of Oxford, and he directed an international interdisciplinary program on biodiversity conservation and management. And before that, he worked at Museum of Natural History and as a postdoctoral fellow. And I think turning point in his career was his PhD at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. And before that, he completed MSc in forestry. And that was from 97 to 2002. And before that, he is basically from Pune, born and brought up in Pune. He did his MSc in University of Pune Department of Botany. And before that, as Dr. Paint said, he was mentioning, he was with Sir Parshuram Bhau College, that is SP College. And he, starting from his 12th, 10th, he had decided that he would go for botany, he would do plant ecology and all that. We are together since last 25 years minimum. And organization Penche sir was mentioning was Ranva, and we work in, have trek through Western Ghats, especially in Maharashtra's Western Ghats, Koina Wildlife Sanctuary. And I would like to mention Gupte sir, he's there. He has seen all of us since our younger days, and quite a few here, they know. And I would request Shonil to start with his presentation. Welcome Shonil here, and there are 83 people, as I see here, now just have their ears to you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. Very kind and generous. मिशन देवराई विषयी ऐकलं होतं एक सेमिनारही अटेंड केला होता, पण इन्व्हिटेशन दिल्याबद्दल धन्यवाद. आणि मी आता सुरू करतो.
जस्ट 1 सेकंड. स्क्रीन शेअर तुम्ही करून सुरू करू शका.
हो हो करतो. दिसतोय ना स्क्रीन?
हो.
आपण हे YouTube लाईव्ह वर सुद्धा चालू केलेलं आहे बरं का.
हो हो, थँक्यू.
मिशन देवराईच्या वेबसाईटवर सॉरी चॅनलवर YouTube लाईव्ह चालू आहे आता.
Thank you. This is a question that I have kept asking myself for nearly last 25 years. How old are sacred groves? And this question has driven a lot of the research that I have done over the last 15 or so years. This research has been supported from a variety of different organizations, British Ecological Society, the Leverhulme Trust, European Union, and I have been very fortunate to have collaborators from the Open University, from the University of Oxford, Southampton, and also Montpellier in France. So how old are sacred groves is the question that is driving today's presentation. My entry point into the world of sacred groves was a visit to Bhimashankar Sacred Grove. And this was, if I remember correctly, when I was 10 or 11, it was a family trip to Bhimashankar. We primarily saw the temple, and we met the priest of the temple, whose surname happened to be Kodolikar. And my mother's family name is Kodolikar. So immediately we struck a chord. The priest showed us around the temple, and that was that. I have memories of that visit. But I didn't know that there is a forest path that went from that temple all the way down to a sacred grove, which you can see here in the picture. Several years later, I returned to Bhimashankar to take part in wildlife census when I was 18 or 19. And then I had a good fortune to visit the shrine within the sacred forest and listen to the Malabar giant squirrel and a variety of other wildlife that is present in this wildlife sanctuary. And after that, through the Ranwa group, a number of friends went there again to measure the forest and to make some calculations about how much carbon the trees hold, whether there are signs of ecological succession in this forest. So finding a more scientific evidence about how these forests have developed over time. And again, I was very fortunate to be part of Ranwa team who were able to go into the Bhimashankar Sacred Grove and do all of these wonderful explorations within the grove. From then, I came across a variety of literature on sacred groves, starting all the way from Kosambi's seminal work to Gargil and Vartak's extensive work on sacred groves, Subhash Chandran and colleagues' work, and also Kailash Malhotra and colleagues' work, which Yogesh Gokhale was part of, and I believe he's here attending today. So sacred groves and the literature around sacred groves is a very Indian phenomenon. Indians have led this body of literature, this body of work, and this has been picked up in the rest of the world subsequently. So in 2006, a colleague, Claudia Rutte, and I wrote a paper about sacred groves around the world. And this was purely based on a review, a survey of literature. And what we realized is that there are sacred groves on every single inhabited continent, except perhaps Antarctica. And there were papers written by hundreds of scholars which narrated the ecological magnificence of these sacred groves and their cultural value to people. So this work started a series of later papers which explored different dimensions of sacred groves. I have also been lucky to be part of a wider community internationally that does research on sacred natural sites. And these are sometimes larger landscapes, and estimates suggest that they might occupy somewhere between 5 and 15% of Earth's land surface. That is a very large proportion of Earth's land surface. And so if we can do nature conservation well in sacred natural sites, then there's a lot of hope for biodiversity and for the animals and plants that we share this planet with. So in this picture, you will see the biocultural diversity on the vertical axis here, with low at the bottom and high at the top, and size of sacred natural site here on the horizontal axis, from small at one end and large at the other. And the sacred groves fall somewhere here. They are relatively small in their size, but they hold a high amount of biodiversity. Temple tree groves similarly are smaller in size, but also have high biodiversity. At the other extreme, if we look at indigenous forest reserves, such as those in Brazil, they have very high biodiversity and they are very large in size. Whereas sacred mountain peaks, such as the Kailash or Kanchenjunga, they are extensive in their area. But because they are at such a high altitude, the biocultural diversity perhaps is not as high. But as you can see, sacred natural sites come in all different shapes and forms, and they hold all different types of biocultural diversity. This is not just biological diversity, but diversity of cultural and traditional practices that go along with the biological diversity. There is recent work on sacred natural sites done by colleagues such as Bas Verschuren, Gloria Pungetti, Jeff McNeely, Gonzalo Oviedo, Robert Wild, and this has built up into a body of literature that has really explored multiple dimensions of sacred natural sites. Some of my own work has taken me to Sabah in Malaysia, and I should mention here one of my PhD students, Ashley Massey, who did early work in this part of the world, and she worked on these forests which are known for the spirits that live in these forests. So people believe that there are spirits that live in these forests, and they come out and dance at night. And there are similar beliefs around the world about animistic beliefs around the world that imagine a variety of special properties that these sacred forests and sacred natural sites have. Ashley also did work on dragon forests in the Gambia in West Africa. And this is a picture of one of the dragon forests. And a dragon is a mythical creature, but in the Gambia, there's an endemic reptile that lives in these dragon forests. There are taboos about not seeing this dragon, and therefore people rarely go inside these dragon forests. Some of Ashley's work attempted to map these forests using remote sensing data and satellite imagery. But the topic of today's talk is sacred groves of the Western Ghats. And I imagine many of you have visited these sacred forests. As you can see here, there are offerings in form of metal tridents or trishul. signifying the presence of Shaivite deities, and many sacred forests being home to gods such as Ayyappa or Shiva across southern India. So the question that I'm going to pose is, how old are these sacred groves? We have always believed that sacred groves have been there forever. They have withstood the test of time, and they have very long history. There are three key things that we need to take into consideration when looking at sacred groves through a historical and long-term lens. First is that sacred groves are patches of forest in otherwise a human-dominated landscape. And therefore, it's important to look at the land use around these forests and what happened outside of these sacred forests as we see them today. Second is that sacred groves are actively protected by people, and that points to the presence of cultural traditions that support the conservation and protection of these sacred groves. And the third is a well-known fact that sacred groves have a long history, although we don't know how long. The only thing that can really get to the bottom of this is historical, archaeological, and paleo-environmental data. And so it's a mixture of these three analytical tools that I'm going to use to answer the question, how old are sacred groves? Before I go on to the evidence, I would like to say a little bit about the research setting. This is the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot. As we all know, it has high population density and yet very high levels of biodiversity. Approximately 25% of the original forest vegetation remains, and this is according to the historical figures that are available, which can be questionable, they can be disputed, but these are the sort of facts that the international community believes about the Western Ghats. And approximately 12% of the geographical area is protected in reserves. These are wildlife sanctuaries and national parks in the Western Ghats. And a large majority of sacred forests are well outside of this formally protected area network. And that's what makes them special. That's what makes them quite unique on the conservation scene. Western Ghats is also a cultural landscape. And if we trace the boundaries of Western Ghats along the west coast here, you can see color shades of pink and red and green here, which correspond with dense settlements, rain-fed villages, or residential rain-fed mosaics. And it's very clear that there is no wild part in the Western Ghats. It's really a very lived landscape. It's highly populated landscape. And that is an important thing to bear in mind, because that whilst that presents challenges for doing formal conservation, that presents opportunities to do informal conservation. And this is what sacred groves are really for. They have served the purpose of doing conservation more informally with participation of communities and through cultural traditions. So this is a real life landscape in Kodagu, which is where I have been doing this work for nearly 20 or more than 20 years now. And as you can see on the hills, there is green vegetation, whereas in the valleys, there are paddy fields and townships and settlements and villages. So it's very much a mosaic dominated by paddy cultivation and coffee plantations in this greenery in the lowlands here. It's important to take a historical look at what was happening in Kodagu. There is some archaeological evidence from South India And this suggests that there were megalithic cultures. So the cultures who erected these large stone-like structures around 3,500 years before present. So that's about 1500 BCE before Common Era, or 1500 BC before Christ. Megaliths were burial sites, and today many are surrounded by sacred forest groves, particularly in Coorg. And so people have always assumed that sacred groves are as ancient as the megaliths, around 3,500 years old. So that's the common belief around sacred groves. If we fast forward to a more recent part of Kodagu's history, which is documented in scriptures and written documents, history before 9th century is based on myths and legends, purely transmitted through the word of mouth. But since the 9th century, Kodagu was ruled by South Indian dynasties such as the Hoysalas, who built beautiful temples such as this Halebidu temple, and the Vijayanagara Empire, which built cities like Hampi, ancient cities. And so these empires were influential in wider South India, but Kodagu as a region remained on the periphery of these empires, firstly because it was a relatively remote part of Karnataka, hard to get to. Once you got there, it was absolutely replete with malaria and diseases which are very specific to the tropics. And so my suspicion is that even though the ruling dynasties lived in drier parts of Karnataka, they didn't quite venture into the remote interiors of the Western Ghats. And therefore, a number of tribes, indigenous communities lived in this region, carried out activities such as shifting cultivation. Fast forward to 17th, 18th centuries, this was a time which corresponds with the Maratha Empire, Maratha kingdom in Maharashtra. So Shivaji, Shivaji onwards. So these Haleri kings in Kodagu ruled between 1633 and 1834. These were Hindu monarchs who built palaces and temples, and they started settlements and townships. So they kind of urbanized parts of Kodagu and really unlocked some of the remote interior parts of that what is Kodagu district today. They maintained a separate identity from the Sultanate in Mysore. Tipu Sultan was ruling parts of Mysore Sultanate around this time, and Wadiyar dynasty was also ruling around the same time with interruption from Tipu Sultan's rule. Then if we fast forward to the 19th and 20th century, British rule was a prominent turning point in Kodagu. British brought coffee, cash crop economy to Kodagu, and that continues even to date. And one reason why Kodagu is a relatively wealthy part of Karnataka. It's purely down to coffee and later tea. So it was a Coorg province between 1947 and 1950, Coorg state between 1950 and 1956. It was a district of Mysore state between 1956 and 1973, and it was then it became part of Karnataka state from 1973 onwards. So here is the map of old Madras presidency in 1913, and as you can see, the boundaries of Kodagu, whether it was a state or a district, have remained pretty much the same. And so this region has a unique cultural, traditional practices that have remained fairly constant over time. Of course, there is much longer history, the paleo-environmental history that we need to look at, because environmental and anthropogenic changes are much older than simply the known or recorded history as we know it. And there are obviously climatic influences, fluctuations in rainfall and solar radiation being important ones. And then there are anthropogenic changes, which are down to a clearing of forests for cultivation, shifting cultivation, and a variety of other anthropogenic practices. You can see windmills here, which is a recent initiative of renewable energy to capitalize on the wind that these high mountains receive in Kodagu. So paleo-environmental reconstruction, this is a sort of time machine. It lets you look back in time. And the principle is very simple. If you imagine an empty basin that over time fills up with layers and layers of sediments, that's the kind of core material of paleo-environmental scientists. So the basin fills up over time, and throughout this time, pollen is deposited within the layers of sediment. If there are fires in the landscape, small or large fires, charcoal particles are deposited. Some charcoal particles are large if the fires are in the immediate vicinity of the basin, and some charcoal particles are small if the fires are in the remote regions around the basin. But this basin essentially attracts all of these pollen and charcoal into it. And so when a researcher goes in and takes a sediment core from this basin, all this history is recorded in that sediment core. So what kind of trees were there, whether there were fires in the landscape, how close the fires were, and we can make rough estimates about how many people lived there, and really get to the bottom of anthropogenic management of a landscape that surrounds this basin. So we took 4 different cores from Kodagu as part of this research, which started in around 2005 and continues until today. There were 2 cores from the sacred groves and 2 cores from coffee plantations, which obviously are only very recent, but these cores go back much further in time, roughly 7,500 years, whereas the cores from sacred groves go back to around 1,000 years. So there is a mixture of time periods that these 4 cores cover. So a typical coring operation involves going into the forest, finding a swampy place, putting a wooden platform. So you can see a plywood platform here with a hole drilled in the middle. And this is the equipment that is used to send the drill or core down through that hole and pull it out to get the sediment core extracted. This is me in my younger days, a colleague, Terry Brunswick, and a number of colleagues from the College of Forestry in Kodagu. So the core that comes out looks a bit like this, and the data that comes out of it looks a bit like this. So this is obviously not an Indian core. This has birch and hazel and pine, some of the European species. But to give you an idea of what data cores can produce, this diagram is a useful starting point. So in this diagram, 10,000 years ago, birch was a very common and dominant tree. But then birch declined over time, and today you find much less birch in the landscape, whereas hazel was non-existent around 10,000 years ago. But it increased over time, and today there is plenty of hazel in the landscape. Pine, on the contrary, went through phases. There was a lot of pine in the early part of the sediment core. Then pine vanished and it reappeared again. And similar story with elm. Started around 8,000 years ago, peaked around 5,000, and then vanished and came back again. And grasses and banana or plantain can also show similar. So these are sometimes cultivated, and their pollen can be found in the cores, which also gives an idea of how cultivated the landscape was. And that becomes an important lens into the history of landscapes. So there are other archives which offer a more social, cultural, traditional perspective. On the left hand side here is the flora of northwest and central India by Dietrich Brandis, a German forest officer who was prominent in the early part of Indian colonial history. And he was responsible for enumerating Indian forests and making estimates about how much biomass, how much wood, how much timber they have. And Brandis was also one who, for the first time, noticed the presence of sacred forests and reported that in his memoirs. So that mention of sacred forests was really important for researchers such as Kosambi and others who came later on, who really sort of went back to these landscapes and found more about sacred forests. Gazetteers are also very useful sources of information, such as this Gazetteer of Coorg, written by General Richter. And this was also an important source of information in my own research. There are also local folklore and cultural folk songs and traditions that are very important in making sense. They are all written in Kodawa language, but I was fortunate to have them translated to me in order to make sense of what was going on in this landscape, at least over the last 500 years. So I'll start first with ecological perspective on measuring the antiquity or the age of sacred forests. And the question or sub-question I'm posing here is how do environmental and anthropogenic factors influence forest landscapes? So a long-term reconstruction of vegetation can lend an insight into this. These are images, light microscope images of pollen grains, a variety of different pollen grains. And pollen analysis can give an insight into changes in species composition over time. Once this pollen data is gathered and brought together, one can look at the ratio between forest and grassland, and this can indicate the extent of forest cover in this landscape. So if you do pollen counts along the length of the sediment, you can look back in time and find out how much forest there was and how much grassland there was. And that forms an important indication of how the landscape looked. So here is image. This is now electron microscope image of pollen grains, and this is a reconstruction based on that. A simple sketch that suggests a variety of different levels of forest fragmentation, from a very closed canopy forest to more open canopy forests. And so counting pollen taxa and classifying them into closed versus open canopy taxa and computing forest grassland ratios can lend an insight into openness of the landscape, which can then be related to the degree of disturbance or human activity in this landscape. So this pollen work was really important in making sense of sacred forest growth. There are other sources of data, and they include, for example, the Arabian Ocean sediment core, which is several hundred meters long, dug out or drilled from the ocean basin, brought to the lab, and then variety of analysis carried out on that core, such as isotopes of oxygen, which give an idea of how the monsoon looked over long time scales. And in this case, this core offers a 300-year resolution and spans 7,500 years. So that roughly corresponds with the sediment cores, one of the longest sediment cores we recovered in one of the coffee plantations in Kodagu. So this data was naturally very useful. The second thing that researchers do with the cores is that they pass them through a magnetic susceptibility meter. And that allows looking at the density of magnetically charged particles within that sediment. And that can be related to soil erosion in the landscape. And again, that gives an idea of how much tree cover there was, whether there was any human activity, and that soil erosion data can be then correlated with monsoon intensity as well as anthropogenic activities such as fire. And then fire can be deciphered in some ways by looking at the concentration of macro charcoal or micro charcoal particles. And this is a simple count of number of particles at each level of the sediment. So all of these three different sources of data were very useful to reconstruct sacred groves of Kodagu. So here is the longer view of the landscape. So at the bottom here, these are years before present. And on the left-hand side is the oldest part of the core, 7,500 years old. And on the right-hand side is the youngest part of the core. So it's the present time, at the time the core was taken. We can quickly glance through the trends in vegetation cover. It starts off very high. Then there's a decline in vegetation cover starting around 5,500 years ago. It reaches its bottom round about 2,500 years ago, then starts to go up again. And roughly 700 years ago, the vegetation cover peaks, and then it starts to decline from that point on. Monsoon intensity starts off high, so very heavy rainfall. Then there's a dry period down here around about 4,000 years ago. And then there's a rise and fall and rise again. So some of this data suggests that the landscape around this time, around 4,000 years ago, was very dry because there were fewer monsoon rains, maybe less frequent monsoon rains. And in general, there was total monsoon rainfall was lower than it is today. Similarly, soil erosion gradually increases and then it drops, and there are some further fluctuations in the more recent part of the landscape. And then most interestingly, fire, which gives a clear evidence of when the landscape burning started. So 7,500 years ago, no burning. That continues around about 4,000, 3,500 years ago, and the burning starts. So this corresponds with the megalithic civilizations that are reported in the archaeological literature. So the people who built the megaliths as burial mounds or burial stones also started fire in this landscape, possibly shifting cultivation. Those fires intensify around about 2,000 years, then they subside, and then there's another small peak here. So these fluctuations in fire are really important to make sense of what goes on in the landscape. I will return to this data specifically for sacred groves, but briefly on the social perspective. So we looked at the ecological perspective and now the social perspective. So the sub-question that I'm posing here is, how do social and cultural traditions influence forest landscapes? In Kodagu, there are hundreds of sacred forest groves. In a small district such as Kodagu, there are around 1,200 documented groves. And we made a rough estimate, a back of the envelope type of calculation. And this is perhaps the highest density of sacred groves anywhere in the world. And so it's quite a unique phenomenon. Part of the reason is that the sacred groves are associated with families in Kodagu, the ancestral spirits. And so the history goes back hand in hand with how the families, the Kodava families, protected these sites as places of ancestral worship or worship of ancestral spirits. In more recent times, the deities such as Ayyappa and Bhadrakali have come in very strongly, and now many groves are associated with one or the other of these deities. But the key point is that there are hundreds of sacred forests throughout Kodagu. A lot of them are now recognized by the communities. They want to erect arches like this, build a small shrine inside, and there is an annual festival which attracts a large number of people within the forest, and there's a lot of feasting around those festivals as well. So a rich cultural tradition that goes hand in hand with this magnificent ecological tradition in Kodagu. So I would now like you to focus on this part of the core, because the data from sacred forests goes back to around 1,000 years. Unfortunately, we couldn't look back further back in time because the sediments from sacred groves were only about 1,000 years old. But that gives an unprecedented insight into what was going on in the most recent period, when in fact in the wider landscape, the tree cover was going down. So there's a clear downward trend in this wider landscape, and that is really important to bear in mind. So on the backdrop of this decline in tree cover elsewhere in the landscape, what was happening in sacred groves was extraordinary. So around about 1,000 years, there was low tree cover or low forest and high grassland. That tree cover gradually started to rise and the grassland started to drop. And around about here, there was a sharp recovery of forest around about 400 years before present. And there are two separate cores from two sacred groves, and they correspond fairly well with each other. And there is that crossing point roughly here where grassland goes down and forest goes up in both of these places. So that makes us confident that actually there is something going on in these sacred forests and not in the wider landscape. Whereas in the wider landscape, if you see, the trend is that of declining forest cover. In the smaller graphs here, there's a charcoal plot, and there's a decline in charcoal from about 500 years ago. So the forest recovery in sacred forests and the decline in charcoal in sacred forests again went hand in hand, which is also interesting to bear in mind. So while the regional forest cover was declining, what happened in sacred groves was local burning stopped. So suddenly somebody decided that no more fires. Forest started to increase, and it reached its peak in more recent times. So there was possibly a succession of forests from a fairly barren grassy landscape to a fairly well-established forest within a time period of 400 years. So until 1600 CE, there was shifting cultivation corresponding with the Hoysalas and the Vijayanagara Empire. That shifting cultivation then stopped around 1600. That led to the recovery of forest. The canopy gaps slowly filled up, forest recovered, the forest understory flourished, and from 1800 years onwards, there was a fully late successional, if you like, forest in these sacred groves. And so this time scale is very interesting and important. So if we now put this in the historical context, what was going on in South India at the time and what was happening within these sacred groves, some interesting results come up. So this was a time period between 13th and 14th century South India. It's written in the literature as being a dark ages of Hinduism. This was an Islamic period, but yet when the Hoysaleshwara temple in Halebidu was built during the Hoysala Empire, and then Wadiyar dynasty in Mysore from mid 14th century onward. While this was happening in South India, Coorg was considered still out of bounds. Kodagu was still a sort of peripheral part of Karnataka or the empires that now is Karnataka state. And so there's a high proportion of grassland and low proportion of forest around this time period. Then if we fast forward to 15th, 16th century, again, high proportion of grassland, low proportion of forest that continues up until the end of the Vijayanagara Empire. So Vijayanagara Empire was located in Hampi and it resisted invasions from the Delhi Sultanate in the north at the time. Mysore continued to be ruled by the Wadiyar dynasty, and Coorg was still on the periphery, so still considered a forested land, out of bounds, difficult to get to. Then during the 17th, 18th century South India, so this corresponds with the Maratha Empire in Maharashtra. At that time, we suddenly see the recovery of forests and sharp decline in grassland within sacred groves. So around this time, the Coorg region or Kodagu region was ruled by Haleri kings, who were the Hindu kings, as we saw before. The region was no longer inaccessible. Haleri kings urbanized, modernized a lot of Kodagu. And also there was an environmental phenomenon called Little Ice Age that was simultaneously rolling out. So in Europe, Little Ice Age led to very low temperatures. There are some fantastic scenes of River Thames in London being frozen and children skating on River Thames around this time period, the 17th, 18th century in London. Of course, in the tropics, in the mountains of Western Ghats, there was no ice, but there was drying of the landscape. So monsoon intensity dropped as we know it, and this led to low rainfall, but also cooling, overall cooling, and water shortages across Asia. And some of the long-term environmental work that is done in southern Indian hills suggests that Little Ice Age also resulted in more barren mountaintops. And so overall, there was a decrease in forest vegetation. So that's really important to bear in mind, because that later on, I'll come to the response to this drying and cooling from the local communities. And then in more recent times, modern period British Empire, commercial coffee cultivation in Coorg that started in the 1800s, there was a continuing increase in forest cover, even though coffee cultivation naturally cleared the understory in the surrounding landscape and left the trees standing for shade. Sacred groves appear to have remained intact throughout this time period. So the key message from this is that there was a recovery of forest from a shifting cultivation landscape to a late successional forest within a time span of about 400 years. And if we look at the early succession, it gives an estimate of about 200 years when the forest can come up from nothing on the ground to high canopy forest. So that's an interesting fact also to bear in mind. So it seems that sacred groves, at least in some cases, emerged only around 400 years ago, and they continue to be present and supported through cultural conservation practices even today. So what happened around the 17th century Haleri kingdom? Was there a land use enforcement by the Haleri kings who were keen on palaces and temples, and perhaps they supported sacred groves and the temples within? Was there a recognition of what we call ecosystem services from forests today? Did people realize that if they want to have their water bodies, aquifers replenished with water, they need to keep forests in the landscape? And was there faith-based conservation that also became prominent during the 17th century? And when you look at the evidence, I think all of these three things were going on simultaneously. The Little Ice Age dried out a lot of the forest, increased the grassland, reduced the forest cover, and so water streams started to dry out further down. That posed problems for agriculture, particularly paddy cultivation. And so people started to recognize that if we don't keep forest in the hills, we are going to run out of water, and we are going to left with no food to eat. So that perhaps triggered a reaction in terms of conservation of sacred groves as these forests that protect the natural springs and send water down into the paddy fields. Land use formalization, possibly. We know that Haleri kings dug out large trenches throughout Kodagu, and these trenches demarcated the boundaries of sacred forests. And so that was an important fact to bear in mind. And then cultural protection, possibly through support from the Haleri kings, cultural protection of these forests started. And so all of these three factors are really associated with the emergence of sacred forest groves as we see them today. So an American anthropologist called Wallace, Anthony F. Wallace, has an explanation for this emergence of phenomenon. And he describes this as a revitalization movement. It is a deliberate, organized, conscious effort by members of a society to construct a more satisfying culture. And so Wallace thinks that there is any particular system of any particular landscape starts in steady state 1 on the top left-hand side here. That then leads to stage 2, where individual stress starts to build up. So there's a small proportion of the community that starts to think differently about the status quo, about the established practices. Then that stress builds up, and a larger number of people start to recognize that cause or a certain important issue. So that leads to cultural distortion. And then even larger proportion of people in the society start to recognize a problem, and that leads to the revitalization of the status quo. And that then leads to steady state 2, which is a gray circle here. And if we look at the environmental movement, we can see this happening there as well. So imagine the 1990s when the Brundtland Commission report came up, and it started to show warning signs of global climatic disaster. That then led to more support for climate movement over 1990s, 2000s. That movement then built up over the subsequent decade. And now with Greta Thunberg and school strikes supporting the younger people, lending their voices behind that climate, the movement around environmental causes is gaining more and more support in the society. So Wallace, if he was alive today, he would suggest that there would be a steady state 2 when the society recognizes that climate change and environmental change is a major issue, and the whole social, cultural, political apparatus will shift in the way it is currently organized. On a much more local scale, obviously in Kodagu, similar processes can be mapped out. So we can compare the social and the ecological here. The social being a change in land use, recognition of sacred forest as an important part of landscape. That led to the change in ecological space. There was enforcement of sacred forest groves that led to early succession of trees. Followed by forest recovery, which gained legitimacy among the members of the community. And then the wider community started to buy into the system of sacred forest groves. And that led to the filling of forest gaps and late succession, giving the fully formed sacred grove, as it were. So these social and ecological processes went hand in hand. So returning to the question of how old are sacred groves, are they 3,500 years old, or are they 400 years old? Obviously, the answer will depend on the location and it will be specific to a location. If there are megaliths or evidence of that nature, it's likely that there is some form of protection. However, one warning is that the societies who built megaliths and worshipped megaliths also started fire in the landscape. So presence of megaliths doesn't alone confirm that the age of sacred grove. But there is clear evidence that over the last 400 years, there has been emergence of sacred groves, and this was supported through three different factors that led to the recovery of forest. And so we can conclude that many sacred groves are very likely to be much less ancient than we often believe. And the forest is remarkably resilient in these groves. Given sufficient time, it can recover. So moving on to the combined social ecological perspective, and I think this is my current interest, looking at the future of sacred groves and what might we be presented with, and how can we actually mobilize support for wider nature conservation using or founding the activities on cultural and spiritual traditions such as sacred groves. So there are three things that I would like to highlight here. One is that given sufficient time, forests do recover. Unfortunately, 400 years still is a very long time scale, and our forest management plans are barely decades long. Some of them are even less, 5 years duration. And so planning for longer time scales within the political systems that we currently live with is going to be a major challenge. But the signs of hope are that given sufficient time, forests can recover. The second is that management of tree cover is very important. And this means that if the wider landscape is tree covered, then it's very likely that the biodiversity within sacred groves will be better supported, as opposed to sacred groves being islands surrounded by cultivated or grassy landscape. And the third thing is that a lesson for other types of forest management is that approach to forest management must be social ecological, a combined social ecological approach, and not just ecological. Because it's important to recognize the cultural practices, the cultural traditions that are supported by communities, that the communities can relate better to. And so that response needs to be recognized in order to plan any restoration or recovery of sacred forests and management of forests more broadly. So with that, I'm going to thank a number of colleagues who are all listed here. And I'm also going to thank the audience for listening patiently. Thank you.
Thank you, Shonil sir, for a wonderful presentation. Pathak sir, I request you.
That was a really wonderful presentation. Hello?
Yes, sir. We are able to listen.
Yeah, because there is a presentation there. I cannot see the pictures. Anyway.
I will, shall I stop sharing now?
Sorry?
I will stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, please.
So continue to you share the screen because of the email.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly.
I request everyone to note down the email of Shonil Bhagwat sir. So in case you have got any doubts or you want to further correspond with him, that will be easy for you.
Right.
Please note down his email. You can ask questions in a chat mode. If you have any questions, you can ask.
About sacred grove in Bhima Shankar, and whether there is any evidence of how old that sacred grove is. That's a very interesting question. I think without paleo-environmental analysis, it will be difficult to pinpoint the age of Bhimashankar sacred grove specifically. But to gather paleo-environmental archives, we need to find suitable sediment deposits. And so if there is anyone in Pune who is interested in looking at sediment deposits, I'm very happy to suggest some avenues for finding the right locations.
Shonil sir, can you help us if Devrais in Maharashtra needs to be analyzed on these basis? If we
Of course, I'll be very
manage to
happy.
collect a poor sample.
Yes, so I think there is some element of historical reconstruction of landscape to find evidence of such as the paleo-environmental data. And from the experience that I have had in Kodagu, I'll be very happy to support the teams if they're keen to work on this topic. So there's a question about from Dhananjay Shedbale about today's development model as a big threat for sacred groves. What needs to be done to protect them as an individual and at policy level? Yes, I think development model is a big threat for sacred groves, and the cultural traditions that have supported them so far have been overturned by more commercial and more extractive forms of development. And I think one thing that could be done is recognizing the commitment of many communities to restore and protect their sacred forests. And that needs to be really scaled up into wider policies, a more community-based approach to that form kind of protection. There's a question about similar assessment done for Pune Tekris. There are some indications, and I think one of the previous speakers, Ashish Nerlekar, talked about the historical photographs of Pune Tekris going back to 200 years and the sort of presence of grassland on Pune Tekris and no evidence of forest creatures being present. I think if you look at Pune Tekris today, I can see a strong drive to revegetate Pune Tekris. And in my view, I think that is essentially how nature is perceived, nature is created. And it's the communities that live around the Tekris are the ones that have the freedom to decide what they would like Tekris to look like. And I think I sense a strong drive in looking at Tekris and for them to be green, which is an interesting angle on Tekris.
Thank you, sir,
Okay,
for
Ashish,
the presentation. If you have any more questions, you can communicate directly with Bhagwat sir, and he'll answer all your queries. Now I request Ajit sir. Ajit sir.
हॅलो.
अजित.
हा,
पुढचा कार्यक्रमाबद्दल काही.
सोनील, थँक्स. खूप छान झालं प्रेझेंटेशन आणि खूप छान माहिती दिलीस, त्याबद्दल पहिलं धन्यवाद आधी. आणि तू म्हणलास तसं निश्चितच आपल्या वृक्ष संवर्धनाला तुझ्याबरोबर पुढे काम करायला निश्चित आवडेल. आणि आपण नक्कीच करू काहीतरी काम या दृष्टीने देवराईच्या संदर्भातलं. पुढचा अजून आपला कार्यक्रम सुनील तसा ठरलेला नाही, अजून बोलणं नाही आपलं झालेलं. पण मला असं वाटतं की 1-2 दिवसामध्ये आपण ते नोटीस काढून त्याचं पुढल्या आठवड्यातला शनिवारचा कार्यक्रम फायनल करू आणि त्याची नोटीस
ओके.
घेऊया.
ओके.
हा